He was 76 years old, and his only son had just abandoned him in a nursing home and locked the door behind him. No goodbye, no call, just the cold silence of someone who had decided their father was no longer useful. Derek Whitmore thought the old man would sit there and wither away in silence, taking all his secrets to his grave. But there was one thing Derek never knew. His father had never really lost anything important, and the morning the truth would come, it wouldn't be easy for him. Like, comment the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed, and stay tuned to the end, because no one can predict what happens next. The morning they took me to Clover Ridge, the sky was the color of old dishwater, gray and flat, and completely indifferent. I remember thinking that was fitting. The whole drive over, Derek kept his eyes on the road and his hands at 10 and 2, very precise, very controlled. He hadn't always been like that. When he was a boy, he used to grip the steering wheel like he was wrestling something, both fists low, elbows out, the way his mother always complained about. But that was a long time ago. And the boy who drove like he was fighting the car had become a man who did everything with a kind of surgical efficiency that I had never quite learned to trust. "It's just temporary, Dad," he said, for what I counted as the 4th time since we'd left the house. "Until the renovation's done. The contractor said 6 to 8 weeks, maybe 10 at the outside." I nodded. I was good at nodding. The truth is, I had no reason to doubt him yet. Not on that particular morning. Doubt is something that builds slowly, like water getting into a foundation. You don't notice it until the walls start to crack. And on that drive, with the empty road ahead of us and the bare November trees going past the window, I was just an old man with a bad hip and a low-grade ache behind my sternum that I'd been ignoring for 3 months, and I was trying very hard to believe my son. My name is Harold Whitmore. I am 76 years old. I spent 41 years building a construction and land management business, from essentially nothing, from a second-hand truck and a handshake and more stubbornness than any sensible person should possess. My wife, Miriam, spent 23 of those years beside me before her heart gave out on a Wednesday afternoon in April, so suddenly and so completely that I didn't have time to say anything to her that mattered. That was 3 years ago. I have not stopped thinking about what I would have said. Derek is our only child. He's 48, divorced, with a daughter named Celia, who I am not permitted to see as often as I would like. He took over a portion of the business when I semi-retired, though took over is perhaps too generous a term. He managed what I had already built. He made decisions I would not have made. He hired people I would not have hired. And slowly, over the years since Miriam died, he began treating me the way certain people treat old buildings, with a combination of obligation and low-level resentment, always aware of the maintenance cost, always calculating whether it might be cheaper to just tear the whole thing down. I should have seen it sooner. I knew the signs. I had watched it happen to other men. Clover Ridge Memory and Assisted Living Center sat at the end of a long private road off Route 9, behind a stand of white pines that were very beautiful in summer and very grim in November. The building itself was a long, low structure of beige brick and aluminum-framed windows, the kind of place designed to look cheerful from the brochure photographs and feel institutional the moment you walked through the front door. There was a reception desk with silk flowers in a vase that had yellowed at the edges. There was a common room with a television mounted too high on the wall. There was a smell, antiseptic and cafeteria food, and something underneath both of those things that I couldn't name and didn't want to. The woman at the desk gave me a laminated visitor's badge, even though I was the one moving in. Nobody commented on that. Derek handled all the paperwork himself. He had a folder, very organized, with labeled tabs. He spoke to the admissions coordinator, a young woman named Patricia with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the pleasant, slightly rushed tone of a man who has many more important things to do today. He signed documents. He handed over insurance information. He asked about the meal schedule and the physical therapy options, and whether the Wi-Fi reached the East Wing, and then he walked me to room 114 and set my suitcase on the bed, and looked around the room with a kind of satisfied neutrality, like a man who has completed a task on his to-do list. "It's not bad," he said. "The room's bigger than I expected." "It's fine," I said. He stayed for 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the nightstand, an old habit, timing things, came from years of managing job sites where every hour was money. He talked about the renovation, about the contractors, about how the kitchen was going to be completely redone and how I'd be glad of it when I got back. He talked about Celia, briefly, almost as an afterthought, mentioning that she was doing well in her junior year without saying where or what she was studying. And then he said he had a meeting he couldn't move and he'd call me that evening, and he hugged me in the stiff, effortful way he'd hugged me for the last decade, and he left. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after that. The mattress was firm in the way that institutional mattresses are firm, unyielding rather than supportive, the difference being significant if you're the one lying on it. The window looked out onto a small courtyard with a concrete path and 2 wrought iron benches. There was a bird feeder on a pole, empty. Someone had hung a wind chime near the door to the courtyard, and it made a small, lonely sound every few minutes. I had brought 3 boxes of things from home, books, mostly, some photographs. Miriam's reading lamp, because I couldn't sleep without that particular light. A coffee maker, because I had been making my own coffee for 50 years, and I was not prepared to surrender that to a cafeteria schedule. The boxes were stacked in the corner, and I looked at them and thought about how small a life could become when you started fitting it into boxes. Derek didn't call that evening. Hush. He didn't call the following evening either. I told myself he was busy. I had always told myself Derek was busy. It was a story I had been telling for years, comfortable in its simplicity, requiring no examination. On the 3rd day, I called him. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, his standard outgoing message, businesslike and impersonal. I left a message saying I was fine, that the room was fine, that I had a few questions about the renovation timeline whenever he had a moment. I kept my voice easy and unremarkable. I had long practice at that. He texted back 2 hours later. Everything's good. Talk soon. Talk soon. I stared at those 2 words for a while. Then I put the phone face down on the nightstand and went to look out my window at the empty courtyard. It was during that first week that I began to understand the difference between being placed somewhere and being abandoned somewhere. It is a difference of intention, and intention is not always immediately visible. Derek had placed me here. I had believed that, but small things began to accumulate the way small things do, the way water gets into a foundation. A nurse named Bridget, a solid, no-nonsense woman from somewhere in the Ohio River Valley, I gathered from her accent, mentioned casually one morning that my son had spoken with the director about long-term care planning. She said it the way people say things when they don't realize the information is new to the person they're talking to. She caught herself almost immediately, pivoted to something about my medication schedule, but I had already heard it, long-term care planning, not 6 to 8 weeks, not renovation, long-term. I lay in bed that night and felt something shift inside my chest. Not grief exactly, and not anger, not yet. It was more like the feeling you get when you realize you've been reading a map upside down, and you have to recalculate where you actually are. Everything you thought you knew about your location was wrong. You have to start over from a different point. I thought about the house. It was a farmhouse on 11 acres off County Road 7, the land I had bought when Derek was 9 years old, the house I had expanded and repaired and improved over 35 years, where Miriam had planted her garden and where Derek had grown up and where I had planned, without ever quite stating it plainly, to remain until I could no longer be there safely. The property was worth something now. It had always been worth something. I had never thought of it in those terms because to me it was never an asset. It was just home. I thought about the investment accounts, the land holdings in 3 counties, the business interests I had retained when Derek took over operations. All of it carefully managed, carefully protected, or so I had believed. And then I thought about the fact that my son had spoken to this nursing home's director about long-term care planning without mentioning it to me, and I started to understand the shape of what was happening. Tim. It was Margaret Chen who first made me feel like a person again instead of a problem. She was 81, a retired school teacher who had spent 34 years teaching 8th grade English in the Columbus City schools, and who had opinions about everything and was willing to share them without much prompting. She had a room 2 doors down from mine, a collection of houseplants that had somehow survived the transition from her condo with remarkable resilience and a laugh that could be heard clearly through at least 2 walls. She was also, I would come to learn, one of the sharpest readers of people I had ever encountered. She found me in the common room on a Thursday morning, attempting to read a paperback novel I'd brought from home, and failing completely because I kept reading the same paragraph over and over without absorbing any of it. She sat down across from me without being invited, helped herself to one of the coffee packets I'd brought from my room, and said, "You've got the look." "What look is that?" I said. "The freshly dropped look. Like someone set you down somewhere and walked away and you're still waiting for them to come back." She poured hot water from the carafe on the side table and stirred her coffee with a plastic stirrer. "My daughter did it to me 6 months ago. Different circumstances, same result." I closed the paperback. "I'm Harold. I know who you are. Bridget told me you were coming. She tries to warn me about the new arrivals so I don't scare them." She smiled, and it was a genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. "I'm Margaret. I was a teacher for a long time, which means I have zero patience for nonsense, and I will tell you exactly what I think whether you want to hear it or not. Now, do you want to talk or do you want to sit here and pretend to read that book?" I put the book on the table. "Let's talk." That was how it started. Margaret had a gift for making things plain. She didn't dress up hard truths or soften them with euphemism. And after years of people speaking to me in the careful, slightly too loud tones people often use with the elderly, her directness was like stepping out of a low-ceilinged room into open air. She told me about her daughter, a woman named Renee, who had decided, largely for reasons of convenience, that Margaret's condo and her savings were more valuable to Renee's household than Margaret's continued independence. She told me about the manipulation, the slow erosion, the way it had been framed as concern and love, right up until the moment it became clear it was neither. "They think we forget things," Margaret said on our second morning in the common room. "That's the great miscalculation. They think age means confusion. But I remember everything. I always have." "So do I," I said. And I meant it. It was through Margaret that I met the other regulars, a small, stubborn community that had formed the way communities always form among people thrown together by circumstances they didn't choose. There was Roy Alcott, 84, a retired machinist who had spent 50 years making precision components and who now spent his days completing jigsaw puzzles of extraordinary complexity with a focus that was almost meditative. There was Dolores Vasquez, 79, who had run a restaurant for 30 years and who treated the cafeteria food with a combination of professional offense and resigned creativity, frequently producing from her room small improvements: herbs in a pot on her windowsill, a bottle of hot sauce, a particular vinegar, that she shared without ceremony. There was Frank Oswald, 86, who had been a jazz trumpet player and who was now mostly deaf but who could still read music and who hummed constantly, quietly, so that being near him was like sitting next to a radio with the volume turned very low. These were people who had built things and raised families and survived grief and made something of their time on Earth. And they had all been placed here by someone who loved them in theory and found them inconvenient in practice. I noticed in those first 2 weeks that nobody came to visit Roy, or Frank, or Dolores. Margaret's daughter came twice, both times to sign something or discuss something financial, and both times left within 45 minutes. I noticed that Derek still had not called. It was on a Tuesday, 11 days after my arrival, that I met Vanessa Cole. She was the administrative director, not just a desk person, but the person who actually ran the operational side of the facility, the one who navigated insurance and legal compliance and family relations and the 100 small crises that arise daily in a place like this. She was in her mid-40s, I estimated, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples and the kind of focused attention in her eyes that told you she was always doing at least 2 things at once. She came to introduce herself as part of what she said was her standard practice with new residents, and she sat down across from me in my room with a legal pad and asked me, directly and without condescension, how I was settling in and whether there was anything I needed. I liked her immediately, in the careful way I had learned to like people, with reservation, with watchfulness, waiting to see what the next layer looked like. "I have a question," I said, after we'd covered the practical matters. "My son spoke with your director about long-term care planning. When was that conversation?" She wrote something on her legal pad. "I'm not always privy to every conversation the director has with families," she said carefully, "but I can look into what's in your file and clarify the current plan. I'd appreciate that." She came back 2 days later. She came to my room and sat down again and placed her legal pad on her knee, and she said, Mr. Whitmore, I want to be straightforward with you, because I think you deserve that. The documentation your son submitted indicates a plan for extended residency rather than a short-term stay. I watched her face. How extended? She paused, just a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to understand she had deliberated over how to say this. The language used in the paperwork is consistent with permanent placement. The room was very quiet for a moment. He told me it was temporary, I said, while the house was being renovated. She met my eyes. I know. Something passed between us in that moment. Not pity, because she was too professional for pity, and I would not have accepted it anyway. It was something closer to acknowledgement. She was acknowledging what I already knew, and she was telling me, without saying it directly, that she was not going to pretend she didn't see it. Thank you, I said, for telling me directly. There's something else, she said. Your son has submitted paperwork requesting that certain communications regarding your care and finances be routed through him rather than directly to you. We have not agreed to that arrangement. I felt the anger then. Not the hot, immediate kind, but the deep, cold kind that settles into your bones and stays there. The kind that is useful. The kind that does not make you stupid. I see, I said. I want you to know, Vanessa said, that this facility's position is that residents maintain their own rights to information about their care, their finances, and their legal situation. We will not be participating in any arrangement that overrides that. I nodded slowly. Miss Cole? Yes? Do you have a fax machine, a reliable one? She looked at me with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. We do. Good, I said. I need to make a phone call. His name was Arthur Gaines, and he had been my attorney for 27 years. He was 70, recently moved to semi-retirement, and when I called him from the common room phone, I had not trusted my cell phone for this particular call, though I couldn't have explained exactly why. He picked up on the second ring and said, in his flat, unhurried Midwestern way, Harold, I was wondering when you'd call. You knew? Derek contacted my office last month, Arthur said. Asked some general questions about estate management and elder law. Didn't hire us, just asked questions. I wasn't certain what he was considering, but I made a note of it. He's put me in a nursing home, I said. Told me it was temporary. I know, I heard. A pause. How are you? Angry, I said. Clearly thinking angry, not stupid angry. That's the useful kind. That's what I thought. I looked out the common room window at the parking lot, at the gray afternoon light. Arthur, I need to talk about the estate. The whole thing, top to bottom. I need to know exactly what my exposure is and what options I have. When can you meet? Can you come here? Give me 2 days, he said. I'll come Thursday. I hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the plastic chair by the window. Then I picked up the phone again and called Derek's number. He didn't answer. I left a message. My voice was pleasant, even. I said I'd been thinking about the house renovation and wanted to talk through the timeline. I said I hoped we could have dinner soon. I said nothing about Arthur Gaines or Vanessa Cole or the paperwork she had described. I said nothing about the cold anger in my chest that had been sitting there for 11 days, gathering mass and weight, waiting for the right moment. I had built a business from nothing. I knew how to wait. Arthur arrived on a Thursday at 1 in the afternoon, driving the same tan Buick he had driven for 15 years, which told me he had not changed much. He was a tall man, thinly built, with a careful precision in everything he did that I had always associated with the best legal minds. The same attention to detail that distinguishes the people who just know the law from the people who understand what it's actually for. Vanessa Cole offered us the use of a small conference room near the administrative offices. I had asked her the day before, and she had said yes without hesitation and without asking why, which told me she had drawn her own conclusions about what was happening. Arthur shook my hand, looked at me carefully, and sat down. He opened his briefcase and put a yellow legal pad on the table. Tell me everything, he said. So I did. I told him about the drive to Clover Ridge, the 22 minutes, the phone that went unanswered. I told him about what Bridget the nurse had mentioned about long-term care planning. I told him about the paperwork Vanessa had described. The routing of communications through Derek, the documentation of permanent placement. I told him about Derek calling his office. Arthur listened. He wrote occasional notes in his careful, small handwriting. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he looked down at his pad for a moment, then back up at me. "Harold," he said, "how much does Derek know about the estate? The actual current structure of it?" "Less than he thinks he does," I said. "I've never given him a complete picture." "He knows about the house?" "Yes." "The business interests?" "He knows about the operating portion. He doesn't have a full picture of the investment accounts or the land holdings in Morrow and Franklin counties." Arthur wrote something. "And the trust?" I had set up a revocable living trust 12 years ago, when a friend of mine had died without one, and his family had spent 3 years in probate court. Arthur had drafted it. We had reviewed and updated it twice since then. Derek knew the trust existed in a general way, the way children sometimes know about their parents' financial arrangements without knowing the specifics. "He knows it exists," I said. "He doesn't know what's in it." "Then," Arthur said, "I think it's time we put some very specific things into it." He set down his pen. "Harold, what do you want the outcome to be here? Not what do you want to happen to Derek? What do you want for yourself?" Nobody had asked me that in a long time. I sat with it for a moment. "I want to be secure," I said. "I want to know that what I've built doesn't just fall into the hands of someone who didn't earn it and won't protect it. I stopped, because the next part was harder to say. "I want to know that the people in this place, people like Margaret and Roy and Dolores, that they're not invisible. Because they're not. They've done things. They matter." Arthur looked at me steadily. "Okay," he said, "then let's build something that can't be undone." We talked for 3 hours. When Arthur finally closed his briefcase and stood to leave, he paused at the door and said, "Derek's going to push harder when he realizes you're not compliant." "I know. He may try to contest your competency." "Let him try," I said. "I've been managing complex financial structures since he was in kindergarten." Arthur almost smiled. "I'll need some time to finalize the documents. 2 weeks, maybe 3. "I've got time," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." He left. I sat for a while in the empty conference room, looking at the table, thinking about my wife's, about Miriam, who had always had a gift for seeing things clearly and saying them plainly and not being moved by the things that weren't worth being moved by. I thought about what she would say if she were here. She would say, "Harold, you always take too long to get angry, and then you get angry at exactly the right moment. Don't waste this one. I did not intend to." 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, Derek came once. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon unannounced, in a mood that he was working hard to present as casual, but which had the particular tension of a man who wants something and hasn't decided how to ask for it yet. He brought a paper bag from a deli I had never heard of, which contained a sandwich I didn't particularly want and 2 bottles of mineral water. And he sat across from me in my room and asked how I was doing in the tone of someone who already knows the answer isn't going to be a problem. "I'm well," I said. "How's the renovation coming?" "Making progress." He said it quickly. "Kitchen's mostly done. They're working on the upstairs bathroom now." I nodded pleasantly. "Which contractor did you end up going with? You mentioned 2. A very small pause. "Harmon Brothers." "I don't know them," I said. "Are they local?" "They came recommended." "Good," I said. I let a moment pass. "The house should be looking wonderful when it's done." "Yeah." He took a sip of his water. "You know, I've been thinking, there's some financial stuff we should probably sit down and talk through, just to get everything in order, make sure things are organized." "Of course," I said. "I can bring some paperwork next time, nothing complicated, just some things that'll make it cleaner, for the long term." "That sounds sensible," I said. He relaxed fractionally. I could see it, the slight easing of tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders dropped a half inch. He thought he was getting somewhere. We talked for another 30 minutes. He asked about the food, about my hip, about whether I'd made any friends. I told him about Margaret without giving any detail. I told him about the physical therapy schedule. I said everything was fine, and I said it in the easy, agreeable voice of a man who has stopped asking difficult questions. When he left, I watched from my window as he walked to his car in the parking lot. He walked the way he had walked since he was a teenager. Quick, purposeful, like he was always late for something. He got into his car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, and I wondered what he was thinking. I went to find Margaret. She was in the common room, working on a crossword puzzle with the kind of focused irritation she brought to things that weren't cooperating. I sat down across from her. "He came," she said, without looking up. "He came. What does he want?" "Paper signed," I said. "He didn't say it directly yet." She filled in an answer. "They never do, the first time." "No," I said, "they don't." She looked up at me then, setting down her pen. "Are you ready for when he does?" I thought about Arthur Gaines, about the 3 hours in the conference room and the documents being prepared and the trust that was about to become something considerably stronger than Derek imagined. "Yes," I said, "I think I am." She nodded, picked up her pen, and went back to her crossword. Outside the window, the afternoon light was going, the sky turning the particular shade of amber that comes just before dusk in late November. Not beautiful exactly, but clarifying, the kind of light that makes things look like exactly what they are. I sat there in the common room, surrounded by people my son would never bother to see, and I thought, he thinks this is over. He thinks placing me here was the end of something. He didn't understand yet that it was the beginning. Arthur called me on a Monday morning, 11 days after his visit, and said the documents were ready for my review. His voice had the particular quality it always had when he was satisfied with his own work. Not proud exactly, more like settled, the way a good carpenter looks at a joint that fits cleanly. He said he'd drive out Thursday again, same time, and I said fine. And we hung up, and I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Something that felt cautiously like ground beneath my feet. The days at Clover Ridge had developed their own rhythm by then, the way time always finds its shape eventually, whether you want it to or not. I woke at 6, made coffee with my own machine, read until breakfast. Physical therapy on Tuesdays and Fridays. My hip was genuinely bad. That part hadn't been manufactured. And the therapist, a young man named Cal, who had the patient seriousness of someone twice his age, was actually helping. Afternoons were Margaret's domain. She had taken it upon herself to make sure I didn't spend too much time alone in my room, which she said was the express route to becoming furniture. And she was probably right. It was in those afternoon hours that I came to understand the full weight of what Clover Ridge actually was. Not the facility, but the community inside it. Roy Alcott, who I had initially read as simply solitary, turned out to have a rich interior life and a remarkable memory for the mechanical details of mid-century American manufacturing, and talking to him was like accessing a library that no longer existed anywhere else. Dolores Vasquez had strong opinions about what had gone wrong with family structures over the last 40 years, and she expressed them with the blunt authority of a woman who had cooked for 300 people at a time and was not afraid of anything. Frank Oswald, deaf as he was, had a way of watching faces that was almost uncomfortably perceptive, and occasionally he would write something on the small notepad he carried and hand it to you, and it would be something precise and true that cut through whatever was being said out loud. These people had been set aside by children, by circumstance, by a culture that had decided the elderly were problems to be managed rather than people to be known. I had believed before I came here that I understood this in the abstract. Living inside it was something different. It made me angrier than anything Derek had done directly. It was a slow, grinding anger, the kind that doesn't flare and burn out, the kind that just keeps producing heat. Derek called on a Wednesday. This was notable because he had called exactly twice since dropping me off, once briefly, a week in, with the quality of a man checking a box, and once to tell me in a tone of elaborate casualness that the renovation was taking longer than expected. This third call had a different quality. He was warmer. He asked questions and waited for the answers. He laughed at something I said that wasn't particularly funny. He mentioned Celia, said she'd asked about me, which I doubted, but filed away without comment. Then, toward the end, in the same casual tone he used when he wanted something, "I'm going to bring those papers I mentioned when I come Saturday. Just some estate management stuff. Consolidation of accounts. Makes it simpler for everyone. Should only take a few minutes. Of course, I said. Whatever helps. Great. He sounded genuinely relieved, which told me he had expected resistance. I'll bring lunch. After I hung up, I sat at my window for a while watching a pair of sparrows argue over something near the empty bird feeder. Someone had filled it recently. Seeds scattered across the tray, though most had blown off in the wind. The sparrows didn't seem to care. They quarreled with great conviction over what remained. I called Arthur. He's coming Saturday, I said, with papers. Then we need Thursday to go very well, Arthur said. I'll bring everything. Arthur arrived Thursday with a leather portfolio that was considerably thicker than his usual legal pad, and he spread its contents across the conference room table with the methodical care of a man laying out surgical instruments. For 2 hours, we went through every document, every clause, every contingency. The trust had been significantly restructured. What had existed before as a reasonably protective instrument was now something considerably more robust, a fully funded, irrevocable trust with specific, detailed conditions governing any transfer of assets. The family home and the 11 acres were transferred into it entirely. The investment accounts were consolidated under the trust's management. The land holdings in Morrow and Franklin counties, which Derek had never known the full extent of, were formally documented and protected. The conditions of inheritance were the part I had thought about most carefully. Arthur had drafted language that I had reviewed and revised twice. To receive anything from the estate, any portion of it, under any circumstances, Derek would have to demonstrate, through documented evidence reviewed by an independent trustee, a sustained period of responsible engagement. Not apology, not promises. Demonstrated action, over time, with evidence. The kind of thing that couldn't be faked with a Saturday afternoon visit and a deli lunch. He's going to challenge this, Arthur said when we'd finished reviewing. When he finds out the scope of it, he'll probably go looking for a lawyer who'll argue diminished capacity or undue influence. On what grounds? He'll manufacture some. Arthur folded his hands on the table. That's why we're documenting everything. Your medical records from the last 2 years show no cognitive decline. We have Dr. Patel's assessments. We have your own correspondence. The letters you've written. The calls you've made, all of it. A challenge like that needs evidence. He won't have any. And Vanessa Cole? I told Arthur about her, about the paperwork she'd flagged, the communications routing request Derek had made, her refusal to participate. She's a witness, Arthur said. A good one, if it comes to that. The fact that this facility refused to cooperate with his attempts to control your information flow is significant. I signed the documents that afternoon with Arthur as witness and a notary he had brought with him, a quiet woman named Janet, who had notarized approximately 10,000 documents in her career and treated this one with the same focused efficiency as all the others, which I found oddly comforting. When it was done, Arthur gathered everything into the portfolio and snapped it shut, and the sound of that clasp closing was one of the most satisfying sounds I had heard in a long time. "It's done," he said. "It's done," I agreed. He paused, portfolio under his arm, at the door to the conference room. "Harold, for what it's worth, what you've built, what you've protected. The provisions for the other residents, the caregiver scholarships, Miriam would have approved." I looked at the table for a moment. "I know," I said. "That's why I put them in." Saturday came the way anticipated difficult things always come, both slower and faster than you expect, so that when Derek's car finally appeared in the parking lot at 12:30, I felt simultaneously that I had been waiting forever and that I had not quite had enough time. He was carrying a bag from a sandwich place and a manila folder that he held under his arm with the practiced ease of a man who carries folders into meetings and expects to leave them behind, signed. He was dressed nicely, not quite formally, but with the effort of someone who wants to be taken seriously without appearing to have made the effort. He'd had a haircut recently. He looked, in other words, like a man who had prepared. I met him in the common room, where Margaret was ostentatiously working on her crossword in the corner and absolutely listening to everything. I had told her about Saturday, and she had said simply, "I'll be there." And when I'd started to say that wasn't necessary, she had given me the look she probably gave 8th graders who said they hadn't done the reading. Derek set the bag on the coffee table and smiled at me. You look good, Dad. I feel well, I said. Sit down. He sat. He opened the bag, produced 2 wrapped sandwiches, handed one across. He talked about the drive, about traffic on Route 9, about how they'd finally finished the upstairs bathroom. He was warm and present in a way that would have been convincing if I hadn't spent the last several weeks watching him not be any of those things. I ate my sandwich, I asked questions, I was pleasant. Then he picked up the manila folder and set it on his knee, with the air of someone transitioning to the next item on the agenda. So, he said, this stuff I mentioned, it's really straightforward. He opened the folder and extracted several pages, stapled together, and held them out across the coffee table. Basically just consolidating the investment accounts under a single management structure. Makes things cleaner, easier to track. The advisor I've been working with says it's standard practice. I took the papers. I looked at them. I read them slowly and carefully, which is my habit with any document that matters. And I was aware of Derek watching me with the particular calibrated patience of someone who does not want to appear impatient. The documents were not what he had described. They were a general power of attorney, broadly worded, and a transfer authorization for the primary investment accounts, and something labeled, with a certain audacity I had to privately acknowledge, Family Estate Coordination Agreement, which was, when you parse the actual legal language rather than the title, a mechanism for Derek to assume management authority over the property and remaining assets. I read all of it. Derek waited. Interesting language, I said finally. It's pretty standard, he said. Which advisor put this together? Guy named Strother. Marcus Strother. He's with... I don't know him. He's good. He's handled some complicated estates. I'm sure he has. I set the papers down on the coffee table. Derek, tell me what this actually does. A fractional pause. What do you mean? In plain English, tell me what signing these documents would actually do. He leaned forward slightly. It just gives me the ability to manage things more efficiently. You're here. I'm out there handling everything. It makes it easier if I have authority to act when decisions need to be made quickly. It's not about control, it's about practicality. And the house? The house is part of the estate. Having consolidated management means the house would be under your management authority. Technically, yes, but... and the investment accounts. Dad. His voice shifted, just slightly, but I heard it. The warmth thinned. You're making this sound like something it isn't. This is just paperwork. Estate planning. You've been putting this stuff off for years. I have not been putting it off, I said. I've been managing it very carefully for a very long time in ways you may not be fully aware of. He looked at me. Something moved across his face. Not quite suspicion, not quite concern, more like recalibration. What does that mean? I picked up my sandwich and took a bite, which was perhaps slightly theatrical, but I'd earned it. It means I've given the documents some thought, and I'd like to have Arthur look at them before I sign anything. Arthur Gaines? He said the name with the particular careful neutrality of someone who is trying not to show that the name matters. Dad, Arthur's been semi-retired for years. You don't need to drag him into... He's my attorney, I said. Has been for 27 years. I trust him. This isn't a legal matter. It's just estate management. Then he'll have no trouble reviewing it quickly. I smiled at him. I'll let you know what he says. Derek held the pleasant expression for another moment, then let it go. Not dramatically. He wasn't the type for that. He just sat back, and something in his posture changed, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was deciding how hard to push. Fine, he said. Have Arthur look at it. He picked up the folder, put the papers back inside, and set it on the table between us. Leave it with you? Please. He stayed another 20 minutes. The warmth didn't come back, not fully. It had a different quality now, more controlled, the performance of it slightly more visible. He asked about my hip. He mentioned Celia again. He said he'd call midweek. When he left, I sat for a moment in the quiet of the common room. Margaret lowered her crossword. Power of attorney, she said. Among other things, she made a sound that was not quite a word. They always go for the power of attorney first. He'll try again, I said. He'll come back with something more aggressive. Of course he will. She picked up her pen. Are you ready for that? I thought about the portfolio Arthur had snapped shut on Thursday afternoon, about the documents already filed and recorded, already beyond Derek's reach to undo through a forged signature or a carefully pressured afternoon visit. More than he knows, I said. What I hadn't anticipated, what I don't think I could have anticipated, even knowing Derek as well as I did, was what happened the following Tuesday when Vanessa Cole appeared at my room door with a look that was professionally composed in a way that told me something was wrong. "Can I come in?" she said. "Always." She sat down and placed her hands in her lap, and she said, "Mr. Whitmore, I want to tell you about something that happened this morning before you hear it from someone else or wonder why you weren't told." My stomach tightened. "Go ahead." "Your son called the facility director this morning. He expressed concern about your mental state. He used the phrase cognitive decline and mentioned that he'd noticed, his word was worrying, signs during his Saturday visit." She paused. "He asked whether we had a protocol for requesting a formal cognitive assessment." The room was very quiet. "He suggested," Vanessa continued carefully, "that if such an assessment were conducted and indicated impairment, it might be appropriate to restrict certain of your external communications and financial activities for your own protection." I looked at her. "He's trying to have me declared incompetent." "He's laying groundwork," she said. "Whether that's where it leads depends on a number of things." She met my eyes steadily. "I want you to know that we have seen no indication of any cognitive difficulty. Your interactions with staff, your communications, your engagement with the community here, none of it supports that characterization. I have documented my observations, and I will continue to do so." "Thank you," I said. My voice was even. I was working to keep it even. "There's something else." She reached into the folder she'd brought. He also submitted a revised version of the communications routing request I mentioned before. This version was more formally worded, with references to his status as your next of kin. We declined it again. "But I thought you should have a copy of what he submitted." She handed it across. I looked at it. Derek's signature at the bottom. That familiar, precise signature, the one I had watched him practice as a teenager because he'd thought a good signature was important. I folded the paper and held it in my hands for a moment. "Miss Cole," I said, "I want you to know that there are legal documents already filed and recorded that address this situation comprehensively. My attorney has copies. You may want copies as well, for the facility's records." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read, something between relief and a kind of quiet, controlled anger on my behalf. "I would be grateful for that," she said. After she left, I sat for a long time. He was going to try to take not just the money, not just the property. He was going to try to take my credibility, my voice, my right to speak for myself at 76 years old, after a lifetime of building and providing and being, in every way that mattered, the person who held things together. That was the part that cut deepest. Not the greed. I had seen greed before, understood it, could work with it in the cold thinking way. But the idea that he would stand in front of strangers and suggest that his father's mind was going, that he would use the natural fears people have about aging as a weapon. Something about that particular cruelty went places the rest of it hadn't reached. I picked up my phone and called Arthur. "He's trying to establish incompetence," I said when he answered. A pause. Then, "How?" I told him what Vanessa had said. I heard him writing. "This actually helps us," Arthur said, when I'd finished. "An attempt to have you declared incompetent, launched at exactly the moment you declined to sign documents giving him financial control. A judge is going to notice that sequence of events." "I know," I said. "But Arthur, I want to be in that room when he finds out what's already been done. I want to be there when he realizes." A pause. "I'll make sure of it," Arthur said. I hung up and went to find Margaret. She was in the common room, and she looked at my face when I walked in, and she didn't ask any questions. She just moved her crossword off the seat beside her and waited. I sat down. "He went after my mind," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was quiet but had iron in it, "Then we make absolutely sure he doesn't have a leg to stand on." Outside the window, the light was fading early, the way it does in December, pulling the color out of things and leaving everything in shades of gray and blue. In the courtyard, someone had hung a new string of lights around the bare branches of the ornamental tree near the path. They weren't on yet, just draped there, waiting. I looked at them and thought, not yet, but soon. The 2 weeks after Vanessa's visit were the strangest kind of quiet. The kind that isn't actually quiet at all, but is filled with the sound of things moving beneath the surface, like ice shifting over deep water. Arthur was finalizing the last documentation. Vanessa was keeping her own careful records. And Derek, as far as I could tell, was convinced he was making progress. He called 3 times that week. Each call was warmer than the last, and each time I detected the same underlying current. The patience of a man who believes he is about to get what he wants and is willing to be pleasant in the meantime. He mentioned the cognitive assessment request once, briefly, framing it as something he'd suggested purely out of concern, something any responsible son would do. I said I understood. I said I appreciated him thinking about my welfare. I kept my voice even and my answers short, and I gave him nothing. Margaret said, during one of our afternoon sessions, "You've gotten very good at performing contentment." 40 years of business negotiations? I said. She was repotting one of her small succulents, moving it to a larger container with the deliberate care she applied to everything. There's a difference between strategic patience and actual peace, Harold. Make sure you know which one you're running on. It was a fair observation. I didn't entirely know the answer. The truth was, the nights were harder than I let on. Not because of fear. I had moved past fear somewhere in the middle of those long conversations with Arthur, when the shape of the protection became clear and solid and real. What kept me awake was something older and less logical. It was grief, I think, though not the kind I knew how to name easily. It was the grief of understanding fully, finally, that the relationship I had spent decades trying to preserve through patience and accommodation and a careful refusal to see what was plainly there, that relationship had never existed in the form I had imagined it. Derek had not become this. He had always been capable of this. I had just chosen, for a very long time, not to look directly at it. Miriam had seen it. She hadn't said it in those terms. She was not a cruel woman, and she loved Derek in the complicated way mothers love difficult children. But she had said more than once that Derek had a talent for making himself the center of any room, and a limited interest in what anyone else needed once his own needs were met. I had defended him. I had explained him. I had told myself it was youth, and then ambition, and then the stress of his divorce, and then the pressure of running a business. I had been very creative about it for a very long time. Lying in my institutional bed at 2 a.m, I stopped being creative about it. He had put me here because I was inconvenient. He had planned from the beginning to keep me here. And he had gone after my competency, had stood in front of strangers and suggested my mind was failing, because I had not been immediately compliant. That was who my son was. Not the person I had chosen to see, but the person he had consistently shown me he was for the better part of 20 years. That grief is a particular kind of heavy. It doesn't announce itself cleanly. It just sits there, in the middle of your chest, and makes everything a little harder to breathe through. I got up at 4:30 one of those nights and made coffee and sat at my window and watched the parking lot lights in the dark, and I thought about my father, a man I had not thought about in years. He had been a difficult man, proud and withholding and not easy to love, but he had been honest in a way I had always respected even when I resented it. He had a saying, "You don't get to choose what's true. You only get to choose how long you wait before you look at it." I had waited a long time, but I was looking now. Arthur called on a Thursday and said everything was in order. "The documentation is filed and recorded," he said. "The trust amendments are complete. I have certified copies of everything, and Vanessa Cole has a packet for the facility's files as she requested. We're ready." "When?" I said. "That's up to Derek." A pause. "He'll come when he thinks the moment is right, when he's decided you've been softened up enough. He'll bring papers again. Almost certainly. Probably more aggressive ones this time. The first set was a probe. He'll have found someone to draft something stronger." I thought about the warmth in Derek's voice on those 3 phone calls, the patience of a man who thinks he's winning. "He'll want to close it out," I said. He's not the type to let things drag. He'll want it done. Then we wait for him to set the date, Arthur said. When he calls to come, call me immediately. I'll be there. You don't have to be present. I know I don't, Arthur said. I'm going to be anyway. I held the phone for a moment. 27 years. He had drafted my first business contracts when I was operating out of a single truck and a rented warehouse, and he had been there for every significant thing since the land purchases, the business expansion, Miriam's estate after she died. He was not a sentimental man, but he showed up when it mattered, and in my experience, that is a more meaningful form of loyalty than any amount of expressed sentiment. Thank you, Arthur, I said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me when it's over. The call came from Derek on a Friday afternoon. He was in good spirits, better than he'd been in weeks. He said he'd been thinking, that he'd talked to his advisor again, that he had some revised paperwork that addressed the concerns I'd raised, and he thought I'd find it much more comfortable. He said he could come Monday. He said he'd bring lunch again. That place I'd liked. I hadn't told him I'd liked it, but I didn't correct this, and that it shouldn't take long. He said it like a man crossing something off a list, like the matter was already essentially resolved, and the Monday visit was just the formal completion of a foregone conclusion. Monday works fine, I said. I'll let the front desk know you're coming. Great. A beat. Dad, I want you to know all of this. It's because I care about making sure everything is handled right for both of us. I know, I said. After I hung up, I called Arthur. Then I went and found Margaret. She was in her room, sitting in the armchair by the window where she did most of her reading, and she looked up when I knocked on the open door, and she read my face the way she had been reading faces for 40 years. Monday, I said. She closed her book. Then we're ready. You don't need to be there, Margaret. Harold, she gave me the look. I have been waiting 6 weeks for Monday. I will absolutely be there. I started to say something else, and she held up one hand, and I stopped. Sit down, she said, and tell me how you're actually doing. So I sat down, and for the first time since any of this had started, I told her the truth. About the 4:30 mornings, about the grief that didn't have a clean name, about my father's saying, about the long work of finally looking at what I had known and refused to see for 20 years. She listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode, and told me how seriously she was taking it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. You know what my 34 years of teaching 8th graders taught me? She said. What? That the ones who break your heart worst are always the ones you loved most and tried hardest for, and that trying harder to love someone who doesn't deserve it doesn't make them deserve it. It just costs you more. She looked out her window. You paid enough, Harold. You paid for a very long time. Monday isn't losing something. Monday is stopping the bleeding. I sat with that for a while. She was right. I knew she was right. But being right about something and feeling okay about it are two entirely different things. And I was not going to pretend otherwise, not to Margaret, who would have seen through it immediately. I know, I said. It still hurts. It's supposed to, she said. That's how you know it was real, even if it wasn't what you thought it was. Pansam. Monday arrived gray and cold, with a thin wind off the fields to the north that rattled the windows in the east corridor and made the common room feel, if anything, more institutional than usual. I was dressed by 7:30. I had coffee. I read for an hour without retaining any of it. At 10 o'clock, I called Arthur to confirm. I'm on my way, he said. I'll be there by 11:30. Derek said noon. I know. I'll be early. Arthur arrived at 11:25, came directly to my room, and set his portfolio on the desk. He looked the same as always, unhurried, precise, present. He reviewed a few points with me quickly, clarifying sequencing. He had spoken with Vanessa Cole the previous week, and she had agreed to have the facilities director available if needed. Not involved, not officiating, available. A witness to whatever the room required a witness for. At 11:50, I went to the common room. Margaret was already there, settled into a chair near the window with her crossword, which was absolutely a prop. Roy Alcott was present too, which surprised me. Margaret had apparently mentioned something to him because he had abandoned his jigsaw puzzle and was sitting near the bookshelves with the focused stillness of a man who has spent 50 years paying very close attention to how things fit together. At 12:08, Derek walked through the front door. He was carrying the deli bag again, and a briefcase this time. Not a folder, a briefcase, which told me something about the weight of what he'd brought. He was wearing a sport coat, which he hadn't worn on previous visits. He looked, I thought, like a man who had prepared himself for a closing argument. He came into the common room and saw me and smiled, and then he registered the room. Margaret at the window, Roy by the bookshelves. And the smile stayed, but something behind it shifted. "Hey, Dad." He put the bag on the coffee table. "Brought the good stuff this time." "I appreciate it," I said. "Sit down, Derek." He sat. He set the briefcase on the floor beside his feet, casually, as if he hadn't decided yet whether he needed it. We made small talk for a few minutes, the drive, the weather, how the renovation was progressing. He mentioned Celia again. He said she'd asked to come visit sometime, which I received without comment. He was doing the warmth very well. He had always been good at performance when the stakes were high enough to justify the effort. Then he said, "Should we find somewhere more private to go through the paperwork?" "We're fine here," I said. A barely perceptible hesitation. "It's financial stuff, Dad. Personal." "I know what it is," I said. "We're fine here?" He looked around the room, at Margaret, at Roy, with an expression that wanted to be casual and wasn't quite. Then he picked up the briefcase and set it on the coffee table and opened it. The documents were more elaborate than the first set. I could see that from where I was sitting, heavier paper, more pages, with the look of something that had been professionally produced rather than assembled. He extracted them and held them across the table. "I had Strother revise everything based on the concerns you raised," he said. "This is much cleaner. It separates the operational authority from the financial oversight, which I think is what you were worried about before." I didn't take the papers. Derek waited a moment, then set them on the table between us. "The power of attorney is limited," he continued. "Narrow scope only applies in specific circumstances. The account transfers are just a consolidation, moving everything under one management umbrella. Really should have been done years ago." I looked at the documents on the table. "And the house?" I said. "The house is included in the umbrella, but nothing changes about how it functions." "Derek," my voice was quiet, "I'd like you to stop for a moment." He stopped. "There are some things I need to tell you," I said, "and I'd like you to let me finish before you respond." He sat back. The performance of patience was excellent. I'll give him that. The door from the corridor opened and Arthur walked in. Derek turned to look at him. Something changed in his face, not dramatically, not the way it would in a movie. It was subtler than that. It was the change of a man who has just understood that the situation is not what he believed it was, and who is recalculating very quickly. "Arthur," he said. His voice was neutral. "Derek?" Arthur sat down in the chair beside me, set his portfolio on his knee, and folded his hands over it. He didn't open it yet. He just sat there, with the unruffled composure of a man who has done this many times and is in no particular hurry. Derek looked at me. "You brought your lawyer." "My attorney, yes," I said. "Arthur has been my attorney for 27 years. I thought it made sense to have him here when we discussed the documents." A pause. "That's fine. This isn't a legal matter, but if it makes you more comfortable, it does," I said. "Derek, I want to explain some things. About the estate. About the decisions I've made over the last several weeks." He was watching me very carefully now. The briefcase was open on the table, the documents beside it, and he was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in a long time, not since he was young, not since the days when I had been someone whose responses he couldn't predict. "When you brought me here," I said, "you told me it was temporary. You told me the house was being renovated. I believed you because I wanted to believe you, and I think we both know that." I kept my voice steady, unhurried, the way I had always conducted the meetings that mattered most. "I found out within 2 weeks that you had discussed permanent placement with the director here, that you had submitted paperwork to route my communications through you, that you had suggested to this facility's staff that I might be experiencing cognitive decline." Derek opened his mouth. I said I'd like to finish, I said. He closed it. You came twice with documents designed to transfer control of my financial life to you. The first set included a broadly worded power of attorney and transfer authorizations for the investment accounts. The second set, I glanced at the papers on the table between us, appears to be a more sophisticated version of the same thing. I paused. I didn't sign the first set because Arthur advised me not to. What I did sign, several weeks ago now, are documents of a different kind entirely. Arthur opened the portfolio. He removed a set of documents, certified copies, each one bearing the filing stamp of the county recorder's office, and he laid them on the table beside Derek's papers. The contrast was stark and probably intentional. Derek's documents were clean and corporate. Arthur's were official, stamped, real in the specific way that legal records are real, the weight of the system behind every page. Derek stared at them. He didn't pick them up immediately. He was reading the top page from where he sat, and I watched his eyes moving, and I watched his face, and I saw the moment he understood. "What is this?" he said. It was not quite a question. "It's the estate," Arthur said. "Current structure. Fully funded, irrevocable trust, recorded and filed 7 weeks ago." Derek picked up the top document. His hands were steady, but his jaw had gone tight in the way it always did when he was containing something. He read. He turned pages. He read some more. The common room was very quiet. Margaret had set down her crossword pen. Roy had not moved from his chair by the bookshelves. Derek set the documents down. "The house is in the trust," he said. "Yes," Arthur said. "The investment accounts." "All of them. The land in Morrow and Franklin counties." He said it flatly, without inflection, but I heard the thing underneath it. The particular shock of discovering that what you didn't know is larger than what you knew you didn't know. "He didn't tell you about those," Arthur said pleasantly. Derek looked at me. "You never mentioned land in Morrow and Franklin counties." "No," I said. "I didn't." "How much—" He stopped himself, recalibrated. "What are the terms of the trust?" Arthur walked him through it. The inheritance conditions. Documented evidence of sustained responsibility, reviewed by an independent trustee, over a minimum period he specified. The provisions for Clover Ridge residents. The fund established in the Trust for Residents Without Family Support. The Caregiver Scholarship Endowment. All of it laid out with Arthur's characteristic precision, nothing soft, nothing ambiguous. Derek listened. His face went through several things, anger, which he contained, calculation, which he couldn't entirely hide, and something else, something harder to name, that I watched move across his features and then get suppressed before it could fully form. When Arthur finished, Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that had shed all its warmth and was now simply direct, "This can be contested. A change of this magnitude, made while you were in a care facility, under—" He paused. "Potentially compromised circumstances." "On what grounds?" Arthur said. "Competency. Undue influence." "Derek." Arthur's voice was patient and entirely without heat. "Your father's medical records for the past 3 years show no cognitive decline of any kind. His physician's assessments are documented. His correspondence during this period, including several lengthy, detailed legal communications, is documented. The timeline of this trust restructuring predates your competency inquiry to this facility by 2 weeks. And that inquiry," Arthur placed one more document on the table, "is itself documented, along with the specific circumstances that prompted it, including your presentation of power of attorney documents the same day." Derek stared at the document. "A judge," Arthur continued, "is going to look at a man who placed his father in a care facility on false pretenses. Attempted twice to obtain financial control through documentation, the father declined to sign, and then filed a competency inquiry when the father didn't comply. And that judge is going to have questions, very specific questions, that you will need very good answers for." The room was still. Derek sat back. He looked at his documents on the table, the ones he had brought, the ones he had paid someone to prepare, the ones he had carried in from the parking lot with the confidence of a man who had already won. He looked at Arthur's documents. He looked at me, and I looked back at him. I had rehearsed, in my mind, what I might feel in this moment. I had thought I might feel satisfaction, or vindication, or the particular relief of a thing finally being done. What I actually felt was something quieter and sadder than any of those things. The feeling of looking at a person you love, or loved, or tried to love, and seeing them clearly for the first time without any of the protective distortion you built up over decades, and finding that the clear view is not what you hoped it would be. He was my son. He was 48 years old, and he had driven out here today with a briefcase and a deli bag, certain that his father was a problem he was finally about to resolve. He had not once, in any of this, thought to ask what I needed or how I was, or whether there was something, anything, he could do that was not about the money. That was the thing that hurt most, not the greed, the absence of everything else. "Derek," I said. My voice was even. "Whatever you decide to do next, whether you pursue a challenge or you don't, I want you to understand something. This isn't about punishing you. The terms of the trust exist because responsibility has to be demonstrated, not promised. I have watched you make promises your whole adult life. I would like, before either of us runs out of time, to see something different." He didn't say anything. "But that," I said, "is going to require choices that only you can make, and it's going to take longer than an afternoon." Derek stood up. He picked up the documents he had brought, his papers, not Arthur's, and he put them back in the briefcase. He clicked the latches shut. He picked up the deli bag and then set it back down on the coffee table without explanation. He looked at me one more time. His face was controlled in the way his whole body was controlled, that surgical efficiency, that 10 and 2 precision. But underneath it, in the set of his jaw and something around his eyes, I could see something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or might have been something considerably less than that. "I'll be in touch," he said. He walked out of the common room. His footsteps went down the corridor. The front door opened and closed. The room was very quiet. Arthur gathered his documents back into the portfolio and snapped the clasp, and the sound of it was exactly as solid and final as it had been the first time. Margaret picked up her crossword pen. Roy Alcott, from his chair by the bookshelves, said quietly, "Well done, Harold." I sat with the weight of the morning and the deli bag still on the coffee table between us, and I thought about Miriam, and I thought about my father's saying, and I thought about the particular cost of finally, irrevocably, looking at what is true. Outside, I heard Derek's car start in the parking lot. I heard it back out and drive away, down the long road through the white pines, toward Route 9, back to wherever he was going. I did not watch him leave. The days after Derek left were strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had expected something like relief. And there was relief. I won't pretend otherwise. The relief of a thing finally done, a confrontation finally had, the long exhausting work of pretending not to know what I knew finally finished. That was real, and I felt it. But relief is never a clean feeling, not when the thing you're relieved about is the collapse of something you spent decades trying to hold together. It comes mixed with other things. Grief, still. A kind of bone-deep fatigue that had nothing to do with my hip or my age. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been vigilant for a very long time and is only now allowing himself to stop. I slept 11 hours the night after Derek drove away down that pine-lined road. I woke at 6 as usual, made my coffee, and sat at the window and watched the early light come into the courtyard. The string of lights on the ornamental tree had been on a timer, and they were still glowing faintly in the pre-dawn gray, small and warm and stubborn against the cold. I sat there for a long time before I felt like moving. Margaret came by at 8:30 with a small pot of coffee she'd made in her own room and 2 of the cups she kept for company, which was her version of ceremony. She sat down across from me and poured without asking and handed me a cup and looked at my face. "You slept," she said. It was an observation, not a question. 11 hours. Good. She settled back in her chair. You needed it. We sat for a while without talking, which was the other thing I had come to value about Margaret. She understood when silence was the right offering. Most people, when they sense someone hurting, fill the space with words. Margaret had learned in 34 years of teenagers and another 20 of living alone that sometimes the most generous thing you can give another person is simply your presence without any demand attached to it. After a while, she said, "What happens now?" "Arthur files additional documentation this week," I said. "The formal record of Derek's attempts, the paperwork he submitted here, the competency inquiry, the documents he brought Monday, all of it goes on record. It establishes the pattern. In case he challenges the trust." "Yes." I turned the coffee cup in my hands. "Arthur thinks he'll consult a lawyer, be told the challenge doesn't have strong ground, and eventually let it go. People like Derek," he said, "usually do their math. When the cost of fighting exceeds the potential return, they stop. And if he doesn't stop, then we're in better shape than he is, and Arthur will handle it." I paused. "He's not going to stop being who he is, Margaret. I'm not naive about that. But he's going to stop being able to do anything about me." She nodded slowly. "Is that enough?" It was the right question, and not an easy one. I thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "For now," I said, "it has to be." What I did not expect, what caught me genuinely off guard, in a way the confrontation with Derek had not, was the response from Clover Ridge's director. His name was Gerald Hartman, and I had not had much direct interaction with him until that week. He was a careful man in his late 50s, the kind of administrator who managed by policy and procedure, and who had, I suspected, navigated more than his share of difficult family situations in his career. He asked to meet with me on a Wednesday morning, formally, in the same conference room where Arthur and I had prepared the documents. He sat across from me with a folder of his own. Not legal paperwork, just notes. And he said, "Mr. Whitmore, I want to speak with you directly about what's been happening over the past several weeks, and I want to apologize on behalf of this facility." I looked at him. "Your son's initial placement documentation misrepresented the circumstances of your admission," he said. "We should have verified more thoroughly before accepting his characterization of the situation. We did not. Miss Cole identified the discrepancies and flagged them, but that should have happened earlier in the process, and I take responsibility for that." I sat with this for a moment. I had not expected an apology, and I wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally. "There's more," Hartman continued. "The competency inquiry your son filed. I want you to know we provided no information, no cooperation, and no endorsement of that inquiry. Miss Cole documented that clearly. But I also want to say, plainly, that I reviewed the inquiry paperwork when it came in, and my first response should have been to contact you directly. Instead, I placed it in your file without immediately informing you. That was wrong." "Yes," I said. "It was." He didn't flinch at that. I respected him for it. "Going forward, if you choose to remain at this facility, I want to put in writing the specific protections that apply to your residency. Your right to all communications, your right to legal counsel of your choosing, your right to refuse any family-initiated changes to your care plan without your explicit signed consent." "I'd want that in writing," I said. "I have it here." He slid a document across the table. "This is specific to your case, and it's also prompting us to revise our general admissions policies to make these protections standard for every resident. What happened to you? The way it was set up, the way the paperwork was framed, we don't want it to be possible for that to happen again." I read the document. It was straightforward and clear, without the kind of language that sounds protective until you read the actual clauses. I signed it. When I looked up, Hartman said, "Miss Cole asked me to tell you she'd like to speak with you when you have time. I think she wanted to say something herself." "Send her in," I said, "if she's available." He left, and a few minutes later, Vanessa Cole came in and sat down where Hartman had been sitting, and she looked at me with the same focused directness she had brought to every interaction since that first conversation in my room. "I want to make sure you know," she said, "that the documentation we kept, every instance of your son's attempted communications rerouting, the competency inquiry, every visit log, all of it is available to your attorney if he needs it." "Arthur already requested copies," I said. "Thank you." "It was the right thing to do." She paused. Just a beat, a small human hesitation. "Mr. Whitmore, I've worked in elder care for 18 years. I've seen this pattern before. Families who mean well and get overwhelmed. families who are genuinely struggling with hard circumstances and make poor choices under pressure. She met my eyes. And families who are simply taking advantage of someone they've decided doesn't matter anymore. Your son falls into the last category. I want you to know I saw that clearly, and I'm sorry it took longer than it should have for this facility to act on it. I looked at her for a moment. You acted when you could, I said. That matters. It should have been sooner. Yes, I said. But you acted. Some people in your position wouldn't have. She nodded once, accepted that, and stood to go. At the door she paused. The provisions in your trust, for residents here without family support. I want you to know what that means to people like Roy Alcott, like Frank Oswald. Her voice was even, professional, but there was something underneath it. They're not invisible to you. That matters more than I can easily say. After she left, I sat alone in the conference room for a while, in the particular quiet that follows something important. Derek's lawyer contacted Arthur the following Monday. Arthur called me to explain, and he kept it simple and unhurried the way he always did. His attorney sent a letter. They're exploring grounds for a competency challenge based on the timing and circumstances of the trust restructuring, essentially arguing that you were under undue influence, that your relationships with the attorney and with facility staff compromised your independent judgment. Undue influence for my own lawyer of 27 years, I said. That's the argument. Arthur's tone was dry. I've responded with the documentation package, medical records, correspondence records, the timeline showing the trust amendments preceded his competency inquiry, and Miss Cole's documented account of the facility's interactions with your son. I've also included a letter from Dr. Patel assessing your current cognitive status. A pause. Harold, this challenge is going to go nowhere. I want to be honest with you about that. Not to minimize it, but because I don't want you spending energy on it that you don't need to spend. What do I need to do? Nothing. Let me handle it. The other attorney is going to review what I've sent and advise his client that the path forward is expensive, time-consuming, and unlikely to succeed. In my experience, that conversation happens fairly quickly. And then? And then Derek makes a choice. He can continue to pursue this and spend money he won't recover on a challenge that won't succeed. Or he can accept the situation. A pause. Or theoretically, he can look at the trust terms and make a decision about who he wants to be going forward. Oh, I thought about Derek's face in the common room that Monday. The controlled expression, the briefcase latches clicking shut, the walk down the corridor. Don't hold your breath on that last one, I said. I'm not, Arthur said, but I leave room for it. People surprise you sometimes. Not usually at 48. No, he agreed. Not usually. What Arthur hadn't mentioned, and what I found out from Vanessa Cole 2 days later, was that Derek had also made one final attempt through the facility itself. He had called Hartman's office directly and demanded a meeting, and Hartman had agreed to a phone call. In that call, Derek had apparently argued that the trust provisions funding resident support and caregiver scholarships were evidence of my diminished judgment, that no person in full command of their faculties would direct estate resources toward strangers rather than family. Hartman had documented the call and sent the record to Arthur. When Vanessa told me about it, I was in the common room. Roy was at his puzzle. Margaret was reading. Dolores was conducting a spirited, low-volume argument with the afternoon cafeteria offerings. Frank Oswald was in his chair near the window, humming something that drifted at the edges of recognition, some old standard I couldn't quite place. I looked at these people, these strangers who had become, in 8 weeks, something I did not have an easy word for. And I thought about Derek's argument, that caring for them was evidence of diminished judgment, that the trust provisions were proof of incompetence. The anger came back then. Not the cold, useful kind I'd been carrying since November, something hotter and more honest. I had spent 41 years building something. I had done it by understanding that a business, a real one, a lasting one, is not just the money it generates. It's the relationships it sustains, the people it supports, the obligations it creates and meets. Every contractor who ever worked honestly for me. Every supplier who delivered on time because they knew I would too. Every employee who stayed because the workplace treated them like a person. That's what I had built. not a pile of money, a network of kept promises. And my son had looked at the extension of that philosophy to the people sitting in this room with me and decided it was the behavior of a man losing his mind. "Roy," I said. He looked up from his puzzle. He was working on something with about 3,000 pieces, a topographical map of some mountain range, and he had the serene focus he always brought to it. "Did you know your care here is going to be funded through a trust provision? Yours and Frank's and Dolores's and several others." He looked at me steadily. "Vanessa mentioned it. I wanted you to hear it from me." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet, not uncomfortable, just considering. "Harold," he said, "I built precision components for 40 years. Tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. You know what I learned from that?" "What?" "That the things that matter most are usually the smallest ones, the ones people think don't count." He looked back at his puzzle. "Thank you." It was a short conversation. Roy was not a long conversation person, but it settled something in me that I hadn't known needed settling. Arthur called on a Thursday, 2 weeks after his initial response to Derek's attorney, and said simply, "They've withdrawn." "The challenge?" "The letter came this morning. No further action. No explanation offered." A pause. "It went exactly as I said it would." I let out a breath. "Okay." "There's one more thing," Arthur said. Derek's attorney sent a separate personal note. Off the record, not binding. He said his client wanted to convey that he may reach out to you directly at some point. That he's... The word used was processing. He wasn't specific about what. I sat with that. "Do you want my advice?" Arthur said. "Yes." "Let him process. Don't reach out first. Don't close the door, but don't hold it open either. If he comes to you with something real, something that isn't about the money, something that looks like actual accountability, receive it like an adult. But don't go looking for it, and don't accept a performance of it." "I know the difference," I said. "You've always known the difference," Arthur said. "You just chose not to use it for a long time." That was the most direct thing he had ever said to me about Derek, and I let it land without deflecting. "Arthur," I said, "what do I do now?" "What do you want to do?" I thought about Hartman's offer, the revised residency agreement, the clear protections. I thought about the senior community I had asked Vanessa about 3 weeks ago, a place called Birchwood off Route 14, which had independent living cottages and its own small garden plots and a community room that was apparently used for things other than watching television at maximum volume. "I want to leave," I said. "Not from anger. I want to choose where I live. I want to be somewhere I walked into on my own terms." "Then do that," Arthur said. "The trust covers everything. You can be wherever you want to be." "I know." I paused. "I'm going to talk to Margaret first." He almost laughed. "Of course you are." I found her in the common room, where else, with her crossword and her coffee and her absolute radar for knowing when someone needed to be spoken with, honestly. "I'm leaving Clover Ridge," I said. She set down her pen. "When?" "A few weeks. There's a place called Birchwood, independent living, garden plots." "Garden plots," she repeated. Something crossed her face. Not quite envy, not quite wistfulness. Something more complicated than either. "That sounds right for you." "Come with me," I said. She looked at me. "I mean it," I said. "The trust covers residential costs for people here who don't have other resources. That includes you, if you want. Birchwood has availability. I already asked." She was quiet for longer than I expected. Margaret was not usually quiet. The silence stretched out between us, and in it I could see her turning something over. Pride, probably, and the particular difficulty of accepting generosity without feeling diminished by it. "It wouldn't be charity," I said. Margaret, you've been the reason I got through this with anything intact. You and Roy and Dolores and Frank. You've been more family than I've had in years. That's not nothing. That's not charity." She picked up her pen, set it down again. "Garden plots," she said. "Yes. I kept a garden for 30 years, she said. before my daughter decided my condo was worth more than my independence. I know, I said. Another silence. Then, quietly, let me think about it. Take all the time you need, I said. I left her there with her crossword and her thinking and went back to my room and stood at my window, looking out at the courtyard. The ornamental tree still had its string of lights. They were off in the daylight, invisible, waiting for evening. Someone had refilled the bird feeder. Properly this time, full to the tray. 3 sparrows were there, and they were not arguing. They were just eating side by side in the thin January light. I watched them for a while. There was still grief in my chest. I don't want to suggest it had gone, or that the resolution of the legal situation had resolved the other things. The years of misread loyalty, the long cost of willful blindness, the specific pain of a son who had looked at his father and seen only an obstacle. Those things do not resolve cleanly or quickly. They sit with you and you learn, over time, to carry them differently. But underneath the grief, something else was there now. Something that felt like the ground beneath my feet. The same feeling I'd had when Arthur said the documents were ready. Solid, real, mine. I had built things my whole life. I knew how to start again from a solid foundation. I just hadn't known, until recently, that 76 was not too late to lay one. Margaret said yes on a Saturday morning. She came to my room before breakfast, knocked twice the way she always did, and walked in without waiting for an answer, which was also her way. She was carrying her coffee cup, and she sat down in the chair across from mine and looked at me with the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is not interested in revisiting the process that led to it. "Birchwood," she said. "Yes." I didn't make a production of it. She wouldn't have wanted that. "I'll let Arthur know to handle the arrangements." "I'll need help moving my plants," she said. "The large ones. The movers always damage the large ones. I'll move them myself." She looked at me. "Your hip." "My hip is considerably better than it was 2 months ago. Cal has done excellent work." I picked up my coffee. "I'll move your plants, Margaret." She nodded once, satisfied, and drank her coffee, and that was that. What happened over the following 3 weeks was not dramatic, not in the way the preceding months had been. It was the quieter kind of difficult. The work of dismantling one arrangement and building another, which is always harder than it looks and never goes as smoothly as you plan. The move itself took 2 days. Arthur had handled the logistics of the Birchwood agreement, and the trust covered everything cleanly, and the transition went, not perfectly, because nothing does, but well enough. Birchwood was off Route 14, set back from the road behind a long drive lined with birch trees that were, in late January, bare and white and stark against the gray sky. The independent living cottages were small, genuinely small, not the fake small of places that call things cozy when they mean cramped, but they were separate structures, with their own entrances and their own small porches, and critically their own thermostats. After 2 months of institutional climate control, having my own thermostat felt like a form of sovereignty. The garden plots were behind the main community building. They were dormant in January, covered in a thin layer of mulch, waiting for spring. Margaret walked out to look at them the first afternoon, in her coat with her hands in her pockets, and stood there for a long time without saying anything. I stood beside her and didn't say anything either. "Tomatoes," she finally said. "What?" "I'm going to grow tomatoes, and basil, and probably more herbs than I can actually use." She turned and walked back toward the building. "Come inside, Harold. It's cold." Roy Alcott arrived 2 weeks after us, with his jigsaw puzzles in 8 carefully labeled boxes and the same quiet self-containment he brought to everything. Dolores Vasquez came a week after that, and within 48 hours had identified every deficiency in the community kitchen and had a list of proposed improvements that she presented to the facility coordinator with the focused authority of a woman who had run a restaurant for 3 decades and was not interested in amateur hour. Frank Oswald took a little longer to arrange. His situation was more complicated, his deafness requiring specific accommodations. But by the end of February, he was there, in a cottage near the community room, with his notepad and his constant low humming, and the place felt more complete for it. I hadn't planned to bring all of them. It had grown organically, the way real things grow, one conversation leading to another, one person's situation becoming clear, one more arrangement handled through the trust. I will not pretend it was purely altruistic. These people had kept me sane through the worst of it. They had treated me like a person when my own son had decided I was a problem. The least I could do was make sure they had somewhere decent to be. But there was something else in it too, something I found harder to articulate but truer. I had spent my whole career building things that lasted. Structures, systems, organizations that would still be functional after the specific person who created them was gone. And it seemed to me, in those winter months at Birchwood, that a life ought to work the same way. That what you leave behind shouldn't just be money in accounts or property on a deed. It should be something that keeps doing something after you, something that reflects what you actually valued, not just what you accumulated. The Caregiver Scholarship Fund distributed its first awards in March to 3 people enrolled in elder care certification programs at 2 different community colleges. Arthur sent me the paperwork to review and sign. I signed it at my kitchen table in the cottage. My kitchen, my table, my pen, with the thin March light coming through the window over the sink, and the small satisfaction of that moment is one I will not try to oversell. It was just a man signing papers at a table, but it was the right man, at the right table, signing the right papers. Sometimes that's enough. Derek called in late February. I had half expected it and half not. Arthur had said people surprise you sometimes, and I had said not usually at 48, and I still believed that. But the call came on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, nothing elaborate, soup from a can and bread I'd bought at a bakery in town. And I looked at his name on the screen, and I held the phone for 3 full rings before I answered. Dad. His voice was different, not performance different, not the managed warmth of the Monday visits, just quieter. Smaller, in a way I couldn't entirely define. Derek, I said. I wanted to... He stopped. Started again. I heard you moved from the nursing home to a new place. Birchwood, I said. Yes. Is it good? It's good. A pause. The kind of pause that has a lot of things in it that neither person is saying. I had learned in 41 years of business and 22 years of parenting that those pauses are best let alone. If you fill them, you take something away from the person who needs to cross that distance themselves. I had a conversation with my lawyer, Derek said finally. After everything, I had a long conversation. Okay, I said. She told me she was pretty direct about it. She said the challenge wasn't going to work and that she wasn't going to keep billing me for something that was going to fail. He paused. She also said some other things, about the situation generally, about how it looked. I imagine it looked as it was, I said. Yeah. Another pause. Dad, I'm not calling to make a big speech. I know what I did. I know how I set it up, what I told you about the house. I know. His voice was flat, without the usual finish of managed confidence. I don't expect you to. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say that I know. I set down the spoon I'd been using to stir the soup. I stood in my kitchen in the February dark, and I thought about what I wanted to say to my son, this man I had known since before he was born, this person I had tried so hard and so long to love correctly. I hear you, I said. That's it? What else do you want me to say, Derek? A silence. I don't know. Knowing is a start, I said. But it's only a start. You know what the trust conditions require. They're not there to punish you. They're there because knowing something and actually changing because of it are different things, and I've spent a lot of years confusing the two. The conditions they're a long road. Yes, I said. They are. I don't know either, I said. That's honest. Neither of us knows. But the conditions exist because they can be met if you decide to meet them. That's the whole point of them. I paused. Derek, I'm 76 years old. I'm not interested in spending whatever time I have left waiting for an apology to become something real. If you decide to do the work, actual work, over actual time, then we'll see what that looks like. But I can't do it for you, and I won't pretend to believe you before you've shown me anything. He was quiet for a long time. Okay, he said. Not agreement exactly, more like a man accepting the terms of something he isn't sure he can manage. "How is Celia?" I said. "She's good. She's really good, actually. Junior year's been hard, but she's handling it." A pause, and then something shifted in his voice, something that was genuinely his, not performed, the way fathers sound when they talk about their children. "She asks about you. She really does." "Tell her she can call me," I said. "Directly. Anytime." "Yeah," he said. "Okay." We talked for a few more minutes. Nothing significant. Weather, his drive to work, a project at the business that had hit complications. Small things. The kind of conversation that is mostly about staying on the line rather than about what's being said. When we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a moment and then finished making my soup and sat at my table and ate it, and I thought about my son. I did not feel the relief I might have expected. I did not feel that things were resolved between us or that the call had repaired something, because it hadn't. One phone call doesn't repair what years of deliberate disregard have built. I knew that. What I felt was something more modest and more honest. A small, careful opening. Not a door. A crack of light under a door, the kind that tells you there might be something on the other side worth eventually finding out about. Maybe. Maybe not. I had stopped betting on Derek, but I had not stopped being willing to see. Spring came slowly that year, the way it sometimes does in Ohio. Tentative and easily interrupted, warm one week and raw the next, as if the season couldn't quite commit. But by April, the birch trees along the drive had leaves on them, small and bright and very green, and the garden plots were being turned and planted by a small and opinionated collective of residents who had, collectively, about 200 years of gardening experience and not a single point of agreement about the right way to stake tomatoes. Margaret had claimed the largest plot and was running it with the organizational efficiency she'd brought to 34 years of classroom management. She had a system. She had a schedule. She had opinions about companion planting that she was not shy about sharing with anyone who came within conversational range. I had a smaller plot, adjacent to hers, which I had decided to plant mostly with things Miriam had liked. Zucchini, which she had grown every year in quantities that exceeded any household's reasonable needs. Dill, which she had used in everything. A row of sunflowers along the back fence that served no culinary purpose, but which she had always insisted were necessary for morale. I was out there on a Saturday morning in mid-April, kneeling on a foam pad that Cal had recommended for my hip and working the soil with a hand cultivator, when I heard footsteps behind me and looked up. A young woman was standing at the edge of the plot, in jeans and a light jacket, with Miriam's eyes and Derek's jaw and her own particular quality of contained energy that I recognized as entirely her own. Celia. She was 21 years old. She was taller than I remembered, or I had simply not seen her in long enough that memory had compressed her somehow. She had her mother's way of standing, weight on one hip, arms crossed, not defensively, but just as a resting position. "Grandpa Harold," she said. I got up slowly, which took longer than it used to and was somewhat less dignified than I would have chosen, and she came forward and put her arms around me before I was quite fully upright, which helped with the balance more than she knew. "You came," I said. "Dad told me where you were." She pulled back and looked at me. "He said I should call first, and I should have, but I was in the area, and I just—" She stopped. "Is it okay that I just came?" "It's more than okay," I said. "Celia, it's more than okay." We walked. The Birchwood grounds had a path that circled the property. Not long, maybe 20 minutes at an easy pace. And we walked it slowly, and she talked. She talked about her junior year and the academic pressure and her roommate situation and a professor she found difficult and a project she was proud of. She talked with the mixture of grievance and enthusiasm that people in their early 20s talk with, where everything is happening at maximum volume and everything matters intensely, and I listened to all of it with genuine interest because she was interesting. Genuinely, not just because she was family. And then after a while the easier topics ran out, and she looked at the path ahead of us and said, "I didn't know what he was doing, what Dad was doing. I want you to know that." "I know," I said. "When I found out—" She stopped. "He told me it was a care situation, that you needed support and the home was the right place, and you were settled there and comfortable. I believed him. Her jaw tightened. I should have called you directly. I should have done that right away, and I didn't, and I'm sorry. I looked at her. She was 21 years old, and she was carrying something that wasn't hers to carry, and I wasn't going to let her carry it if I could help it. Celia, I said, you were being told something by your father. You had no reason at that point to disbelieve him. What you could have done differently. Maybe. But I'm not interested in building a case against you. You're here. That's what I care about. He's trying, she said quietly. I don't know if you know that or if it means anything, but something shifted. After everything came out, he's been different. She paused. Not completely. He's still, you know how he is, but there are things he's doing differently. Actual things. Not just saying it. I thought about the phone call, the flatness in his voice, the absence of performance. I know what I did. I'm watching, I said. That's all I can tell you. I'm willing to watch. She nodded. We walked a little further in silence, and then she said, Can I come back? Just to visit? I don't want anything. I just want to know you. I had to stop walking for a moment. 21 years old, Miriam's eyes, and she wanted to know her grandfather, this old man who had spent the last several months being legally disputed over and medically questioned and systematically underestimated, and she was standing on a path in April light and asking if she could simply come back. Yes, I said. Celia, yes. Tamma. Roy finished his mountain range puzzle in May, all 3,000 pieces, and held a small ceremony in the community room that consisted of him standing back and looking at it for a long moment with his hands in his pockets, then quietly beginning to take it apart. When Margaret asked him why he wasn't going to frame it, he said, without looking up, "What's the point of a puzzle you've already solved?" Margaret told me this story that evening, and I laughed, genuinely, without effort, the way you laugh when something is simply true and funny and doesn't need anything added to it. It was the first time I had laughed like that in longer than I could precisely remember. Frank Oswald started a Wednesday evening music session in the community room. Informal, unannounced, just Frank with his old sheet music and a keyboard someone had donated, playing things from the 40s and 50s at a volume he couldn't hear himself but which filled the room entirely. People came. Not because they were organized into it, not because there was a schedule posted, but because the music moved down the corridors and under the doors, and you followed it the way you follow a smell from a kitchen when you didn't know you were hungry. Dolores negotiated with the facility kitchen and won. I don't know the details of the negotiation because she didn't share them, but the food improved measurably in April, and she started supplementing Tuesday dinners with things she made herself in the community kitchen, and nobody complained, and the Tuesday dinners became a thing people showed up for. These were small things. I want to be clear about that. They were not grand resolutions or triumphant conclusions. They were just the ordinary texture of people living their lives with a reasonable amount of dignity and enough comfort and the company of other people who saw them clearly. That is not a small thing, it turns out. That is, in fact, everything. I am 76 years old. I have a bad hip and a cottage with its own thermostat and a garden plot with Miriam's zucchini in it. I have a granddaughter who drives out on alternating weekends and talks at me for 2 hours about her life, and I listen to every word of it. I have Margaret next door and Roy with his puzzles and Frank with his music. I have Arthur, who calls every few weeks with no particular agenda, just to talk, which I think is his version of checking in without acknowledging that he's checking in. I have Vanessa Cole's documented records and Gerald Hartman's written protections, and the knowledge that what I built will keep doing something after I am gone. I have a son who is, as of this telling, doing some actual things differently and not others, and with whom I have spoken 6 times since February, each call a little less careful than the last. I don't know what that becomes. I have stopped trying to know in advance. Here is what I want to say to you, whoever you are, wherever you are watching from, whatever your particular version of this story looks like. There is a kind of love that is actually just control wearing love's face, and there is a kind of loyalty that is actually just fear of what happens if you look too clearly at something. I spent decades practicing both of those things and calling them by the right names, and it cost me more than the money ever could have. You have the right to protect what you have built. Whether you are 76 or 50 or 32, the things you have earned, the life you have made, the dignity you carry, none of it is forfeit just because someone who shares your blood has decided their convenience matters more than your humanity. That is not love. Love doesn't keep a running total of what you owe. The people who treat you like a burden are showing you something true about themselves. Believe them. Believe them the first time and the second time, and stop waiting for the third time to be different. And the people who see you, the Margarets, the Roys, the Vanessa Coles, who document things and hold ground and tell you what's true when it would be easier to look away. Those people are the real inheritance, not the money, not the property. The people who show up and stay and tell you the truth and help you find the ground under your feet again. I don't think life gives you a clean ending. I don't think the grief goes away, or the complicated love simplifies itself, or the people who hurt you suddenly become different people because enough time has passed. That is not how any of this works, and I am too old to pretend it is. But I think you can find, even late, even after a long time of not looking, the place where you actually belong. I think you can stop performing contentment and start building something that deserves the name. I think you can look at what is true, finally, and not be destroyed by it. I looked at it. I am still here. I have tomatoes coming in the garden, and a granddaughter who wants to know me, and a string of lights somewhere that come on at dusk. And on most days, that is enough to feel like more than enough. My name is Harold Whitmore. I am 76 years old. I was abandoned in a nursing home by my only son, and I did not disappear. I did not fade. I did not sign the papers. I built something that could not be undone. And then I went home. Not the home I came from, but the one I chose. And there is a difference between those two things that I wish I had understood 40 years sooner. But I understand it now. And now, it turns out, is not nothing. Now is where I am, and I intend to stay.